Welcome back to Studio One, where my guest today with me is Honorable Bob Rae, Member of Federal Parliament of Canada. Bob, just about literally half an hour, 45 minutes ago, the Governor General announced the dissolution of the government, and as a result of the no confidence move, which was presented yesterday by the Liberals. And you've been there, you've seen that before. You've been there since 1979, the first dissolution of Parliament with your presence, which you started. Then came the, and every time, the funny thing is, every time that you do that, or this is done, the Liberals have come back into power. So talk to our audience about it.
Well, in each time there's always a reason. In 1979, it was Mr. Clark who was the Prime Minister who brought in a terrible budget. And he said he was going to govern as if he had a majority when he didn't have a majority. So we tested it, we defeated the budget, and there was an election and Mr. Trudeau came back as the Prime Minister. In 1985, it was an interesting election because we'd had in Ontario, we'd had a Conservative government for 42 years. It was like a dynasty. And in that election, Mr. Miller won seats and Mr. Peterson won seats and we won some seats. We were the third party, and Mr. Miller felt he could govern as if nothing had changed. It was a minority. And Mr. Peterson and I sat down and said, we need to talk about how we can make change happen in the country, in the province. And that's what happened. And then 5 years later, I became the Premier. This time it's been, we've had a minority government for 5 years of Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper's style of governing is that he does not want to really engage with the other parties. He does not want to see if we can find a way of accommodating each other. And we've always been on the brink of crisis in in Parliament. Every election, every vote is a confrontation. And the last 4 months we've been trying to get information from the government about how much money is going to be spent on these fighter jets. We follow the estimates process in London and in Washington and in Oslo and in all the capitals of Europe. Every government there is saying these planes are becoming too expensive, the contract price is going up, it's not going to work. They're cutting back on their orders, they're having to deal with it. In the American Congress, there's a crisis underway dealing with it. So in our case, we've asked the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the man who's in charge of giving us as members of Parliament information, and he says the cost is not going to be 16 billion, it's going to be 30 billion. We know that the Conservatives are planning to build more and more bigger mega prisons across the country. The cost of that will also run in the billions because of the way in which they're approaching the crime issue, which we think is wrong-headed. The Americans are moving away from that approach. The British are moving away from that approach. Other governments are moving away. Canada's, is going backwards. And then you've got the corporate tax cuts. We don't think this is a time to be cutting the taxes on the biggest corporations in the country when working families are struggling, having a hard time making ends meet, and we think that's a real problem. So we asked the government to account for these problems. Just tell us how much this is really going to cost. Tell us how this is going to work out. And every step of the way, the government resisted. Finally, the Speaker said to the government, you have to give them this information. Parliament has a right to this information. And the government said, well, we'll give you some of it, but we're not going to give you all of it. And we said at that point, look, this is just not the way to govern. Mr. Harper's prorogued Parliament twice. He's avoided votes of confidence. He's done everything he can in his power to avoid acting like a Democrat. And that comes with a price. So I know people say, well, not a great time for an election. We say, look, Mr. Harper has to take some responsibility for what's happened. This is just not.
You summed it up very nicely. The whole crux of the issue and wherever these objections and differences were. But let me address them one by one, just for my audience's sake, so we can have a better understanding and grasp of the situation here, Bob. A couple of things that you mentioned. You talked about the corporate tax cuts. You talked about Mr. Harper's policy of buying the F-35s, which in your opinion is going to be, which the latest numbers show is going to be $30 billion and not 16 as we talked, the prisons and a couple of other factors. So basically the government was not brought down on any of these individual factors, but on contempt of Parliament.
That's right. On failing to do what every government is supposed to do. You know, we operate under the British parliamentary system, and Pakistani listeners will understand, you know, the importance of this tradition of Parliament having the right to make a decision. We go back to, you know, Magna Carta, back to Runnymede, back to Charles I, you know, back to Parliament saying, the Parliament's first responsibility is to control how the money is spent. That's Parliament's first job. And if a government refuses to be accountable to Parliament, we have a real problem. And that's what's happened. Fundamentally, that's the issue at heart. The issue at heart is, it's about, obviously, the substance of the issues, and it's also about this process, which is critical to our democracy.
But do you think that really is an action which was taken upon the initiatives of the opposition parties, taken by the opposition parties, obviously, but was it an initiative of the opposition parties? Because do you not see that Mr. Harper has created a scenario in which he has actually trapped everybody else to ask for a defeat and then look for an election? Because what has happened in the previous elections, 2006, 2008, and today? Every time the Conservatives came back winning more votes than they had before. Yeah. So does it not appear to be an entrapment?
Well, I personally don't feel that way. I do think that ultimately, I think Canadians have to decide what they want. If they say we want to have a government that overspends, we want to have a government that doesn't respond to what we want to have a government that's aloof and that's remote and that doesn't deal directly with us. I guess Canadians can choose that, but I personally don't think that's what's going to happen. I think Canadians are going to see that this election is about some very, very fundamental issues. It's about the kind of Canada that they want. It's about the kind of country that they want. It's about the sort of government that they want. How do they want their government to respond? Do they want the government to be in their corner? Do you want a government that's going to spend $30 billion, and for all we know more, because of all the factors that are built into this one-off contract? Right. Or do you want to say, let's have a competitive process and let's live within our means when it comes to how we're going to provide for our armed forces?
Right.
That's a critical issue.
But keeping in mind, Bob, that the House was, the government was not brought down on the $30 billion issue, but on the information related to the $30 billion issue. Well, that led to the contempt, basically.
Yeah, that's true, but I think you've also got to look at the underlying substance of the issues. As I said, there's two issues. There's the substance. There's the substance of the contract on the fighter jets. There's a substance on the issue of prisons. There's a substance on the issue of corporate tax cuts. Those are the substantive issues which are behind this election.
Right. So how closely or how much intensity these issues have, or how much influence these issues have on the life of an ordinary Canadian?
Huge.
Direct impact. Talk to me about the direct impact. Tell us.
Because if governments spend money, this is a $40 billion package. Okay? $40 billion.
Right.
It's a huge amount of money.
It is.
Huge amount of money. If governments are spending money that way, then they can't spend money other ways. They can't spend money on tax cuts for ordinary families. They can't spend money on child care for ordinary families. They can't spend money on health care for ordinary families. They can't spend money on helping families with the cost of education. That's why it's about these fundamental choices. That's why people have to, I think, will come to understand, as a Liberal program says, look, we're not going to do this, we're going to do that. We're not going to give a corporate tax cut to the banks and the insurance companies and the oil companies of $6 billion. We're going to make sure that there are programs in place for you and for your families, that there's help on the way for you. And I think as that choice becomes clear to people, I think people will say, well, we would rather have help for cost of university education. We'd rather have help for childcare. We'd rather have a better healthcare system, a better home care program. We'd rather have those things in place than have the kinds of irresponsible giveaways that the Conservatives are now.
On a grassroots level, Bob, this actually is going to be your third election on board with Liberals, actually. And the first election, I remember you were a candidate for the leadership,
yes.
and that was Stéphane Dion. The second, you were a candidate, and it was then Mr. Ignatieff. This is now the third election. Obviously, you haven't announced your candidacy for the Liberal leadership, but my question goes asking, there is another factor that we always forget, and that's NDP.
Yes.
NDP also gained number of seats in the province of Ontario and BC in the previous elections.
Right.
So let's not discard, every time we are talking about, and Mr. Harper talks about elections and Mr. Ignatieff talks about elections, we totally and completely forget about the NDP, the party that you made, that you helped build, actually. We have to cut down to a short break. It's time for a short break. We continue watching Studio One. We're having a very interesting conversation with Bob Rae, Honourable Member of Parliament. Keep watching. We'll be right back.